Welcome everyone again to another episode of the ideaXme show, that show that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world, inspiring future and future thinkers and creators, and all for those like great stories. I'm Ira Pastor, your life sciences ambassador, along for the journey today. Today we are joined by Matthew Richardson. Matthew is a Canadian author, primatologist, conservationist. He began his career as a writer of actually historical nonfiction, although for the last several years he's been mainly working on academic projects related to wildlife conservation. In 2001, he published the Royal Book of Lists, an irreverent romp through royal history from Alfred the Great to Prince William. But for much of the next decade, he worked as a primatologist and a taxonomist for the United States-based NGO Conservation International, co-authoring various books and academic papers. Notable among these were the titles Lemurs of Madagascar and the massive primate volume, the Handbook of the Mammals of the World series, for which he also produced all the maps. He lived and worked for a while at the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust on the Isle of Jersey in the Channel Islands. Named after British naturalist, zookeeper, conservationist, author, and television presenter Gerald Durrell. In addition to his writing and editing activities, he also consulted with various scientists the world over on questions of conservation and taxonomy. He helped catalog the Royal Ontario Museum Primatology Collection. He's given lectures. He served as an active member of IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and the Species Survival Commission Primate Specialist Group. And he currently has a new book in press entitled Threatened and Recently Extinct Vertebrates of the World, the Biogeographic Approach. Matthew, thank you for taking the time to come on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. Typically we start off the show by giving our guests the floor for a while, just to talk about yourselves, ask the big question, who are you? And tell us all about your background and how you got involved in this really fascinating intersection of conservation.
Well, it's certainly non-traditional. I'm not a scientist. I basically started off as an historian, and that's kind of where I wish I was. I fell into conservation, almost by accident. Although I have had a lifelong interest. I was always a big fan when I was a kid of people like Gerald Durrell, people, some of those kinds, David Attenborough's, those sorts of people. And I actually wrote a biography of Gerald Durrell. I wrote the first biography of Gerald Durrell, and it never got published. They shut it down pretty quick. But I became friends with Lee Durrell, his wife, and I've since been associated with the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. I lived and worked there. But I've been involved with a lot of other NGOs as well. For a long time, I was with Dr. Russell Mittermeier at Conservation International. My main interest was primates. I've done a lot of work with lemurs and that sort of thing. But at the back of it, I was always just primarily interested in endangered species. And that goes back to a book that I read when I was a child called Let Them Live. And Let Them Live was a little volume produced by a very obscure Swedish professor named Kai Curry Lindow. And although forgotten today, he was one of the pioneers. He was certainly in the 1960s. If you want to say that the modern conservation movement really took off in the 1950s, 1960s with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, well, he was right there. And he was certainly, he did one of the first books, one of the first really important books on endangered species. There were others, people like James Fisher, Gerald Durrell was certainly one of them. But anyway, I found his book, or someone gave me a copy of his book, and I just thought it was wonderful. It was like a world tour of endangered species. You would go around the world, Africa, Asia, and I just became fascinated by all these, these animals that had gone extinct or which were extremely threatened. I don't use the word endangered. I use, whatever. threatened by, for one reason or another, generally on islands, places like that. And so it was a combination of an interest of, interested in geography, but also just the rarest of the rare, I suppose. And it was one of the most important books of my childhood. There were others. I love Gerald Durrell's books, like My Family and Other Animals. Um, I I was interested in all of it, but this was one that sort of stuck out, and I had it in the back of my mind for decades as I was doing other projects. I wanted to do a big book on primates. I wanted to do the book on primates. And weirdly enough, it wasn't long before Dr. Russell Mittermeier at Conservation International, who's a remarkable individual. I'm sure I don't need to give you his history, and Professor Colin Groves both became interested in firstly in my taxonomic approach, and in my subsequent 4-volume Living Primates book, which never got published because we decided to do other projects based on it. So I ended up doing like the Lemurs of Madagascar field guide and various other things. I became involved in primate conservation, but only in a sort of very peripheral way. I was involved with the IUCN. I was with the Global Mammal Assessment, but not being a scientist, I was never really taken seriously. I was just sort of this crackpot that would show up at meetings and sort of interrupt the serious scientists, But I think I made my little contribution. I did my bit, and then always at the back of my head, I thought, well, I still want to do that one book. I want to do that one book on, based on Let Them Live. And I began it about 10 years ago, just as basically, and I don't know how far you want to go into this, but as far as my personal life sort of started crashing around me. And so it's been a tough 10 years. I've lost most of my family and most of my friends from one reason or another. And I ended up living in a very remote chalet in the woods in the Laurentians of Quebec, where I'm speaking to you now from. I think that's split infinitive or something, isn't it? But anyway, that's where I am. And so I've been working on this sort of intermittently, and it's coming to an end. I was very fortunate in finding Cambridge University Press.
Sure.
I think my late father would have been very proud of that, because he was, I hope he would have been, because, it's one of the oldest, I think it is the oldest publisher in the world. And I think, and it's certainly been the perfect academic publisher for my purposes. They've been very forgiving. My deadline for this book was a year ago, and I'm still scribbling away, scribble. But the thing about it is, in my defense, it's 15,000 taxa, vertebrate taxa. The book is called Threatened and Recently Extinct Vertebrates of the World, and it's every mammal, bird, reptile, amphibian, and fish everywhere in the world that's deemed to be endangered.
Sure.
What do we mean by endangered? Endangered, in that definition, means critically endangered, or vulnerable. I tend to extend that definition. I think that one of the lessons I've learned from doing this book is there's far more endangered species than we've been able to keep up with. That partly it's due to taxonomic splitting. Other reason is what I call the data deficient garbage can, where people don't know anything about a particular species or subspecies, and so they just put it in data deficient. We'll get back to it later. And it's weird, because while I'm researching my book, I rely heavily on redlist.org. Redlist is sort of the international convening body, the IUCN's Red List. They're sort of the ones in charge. They're the FIFA of endangered species, if you will,
Sure.
And it's weird, because I'll be researching a species, and I'll look up a particular gibbon or something, and I'll look at the assessment, and I'll think, oh God, that's garbage. Who did that? It says nothing. It makes no decision. Who did that? And I'll look at it was me 15 years ago. right? You know, and it hasn't been looked at since. And so that's what I mean. I mean, there are lots of species. There's one that comes to mind. It's a very obscure species of frog. It's called a cryptic litter frog, and it's from some nothing island off the coast of Malaysia. And it's known only from a single cave at the top of a mountain on a tiny island off the coast of Malaysia. And they've listed it as least concern. Least concern meaning you don't have to worry about it because, you know, it's on this island. What could possibly go wrong? Right. You know, and so it's my contention. I take a broader view of threat. But I also, there are cases where species or subspecies are deemed endangered, where I say, no, they're not. They're fine. They're living in a national park. They're fine. And that brings me to another issue. I mean, because we're living in such a dumbed down age that, you know, people, like, if you don't keep pushing the giant pandas and the rhinos and everything, you know, people are just going to tune out, you know. And Gerald Durrell had the same, you know, I mean, I wasn't the first one to discover this. Gerald Durrell said the same thing 50 years ago. Like, he was a champion of the uglies, the little brown frogs, all of which look like every other little brown frog, you know. But it's true. It really is. Like, the frontiers of conservation have shifted, and it's no longer about giant pandas. It is about rhinos. Rhinos, seriously, I mean, they seriously are. Right. I mean, obviously, but I mean, giant pandas, they're fine. Giant pandas are going to be fine. Because people are going to make sure that they're going to be fine. Right. The ones that are going extinct, and literally every single day, are freshwater fish in Turkey and Central America, and in particular frogs and salamanders, particularly in Central and South America. That's the frontier right now. Okay. That's where it all has to go. I mean, it really does. I shouldn't say it all has to go. And I'm thinking back. You may have heard about how the Edinburgh Zoo, a wonderful institution in Scotland, how they spent a ridiculous amount of money trying to get their giant pandas to breed, and they couldn't do it. Okay. And so I don't know where they are with that, whatever. And it, you know, people were saying, well, if they had spent a fraction of that money on Asian one-horned rhinoceros, you know, or you know, that they may have actually saved a subspecies or two, or two-horned, not one-horned, well, both actually, but two-horned. And anyway, to make a long story short, it is true that a case can certainly be made that if you were to spend certain monies on just breeding up frogs, breeding up freshwater fish, or preserving their habitat, you'd be doing, you know, a hell of a lot more, I think, in my opinion. I mean, I'm seeing species like going extinct literally every day. I'm seeing things that I wasn't ready for. I had no idea of the scale of it. I mean, and it's particularly, it's Turkey, Anatolia, Turkey, you know, the Middle East in general, where, you know, due to water extraction, drought, other factors, pollution, the freshwater fish they're just taking a beating. They're you know, and again, Central and South America with frogs, you know, with amphibians in general, because of chytrid fungus and, you know, other factors. That's it. That's where we really have to fight right now, because there's a difference between urgency and emergency, right? I mean, like, you know, like some things are urgent, maybe not as, you know, as critically important, but some things are more urgent, and these things are going extinct. These creatures, these freshwater fish and these frogs and salamanders are going extinct without anybody even bothering to give them a common name or even to photograph them. That's the thing. I've tried to breathe some life, so get people to care. Yeah. You know, I mean, here it is. I don't know whether you've had a chance to take a look through, you know, the draft of my book, and a lot of it is just fish, frog. But I mean, that's where we are, right? You know, and then up until recent decades, zoos were sort of taking the forefront, of captive breeding and things like that. I'm not so sure that zoos are even able, even if they, with all the best intentions in the world, I'm not so sure that zoos are even the answer anymore, because zoos are themselves endangered species, and there's only so much money to go around, and I don't know. I think that as we talked in our pre-interview about the IUCN, and I need to be careful about this, but I'm not sure that model of committee-based protection is working anymore. The idea that scientists get together, and keep the information current, it just doesn't seem to be happening. If you go through the red list, they do make an effort to update every now and then, but with all the best intentions in the world, I'm not sure that even works anymore.
Let's introduce the concept there for people that may be
Okay.
unfamiliar with it, of biogeography. So sort of, there's
Sure.
just general definition on the internet, sort of the study of the distribution of species and ecosystems in geographic space and throughout geologic time. And it points out how these various communities of different biologic organisms that vary substantially, whether we're talking about latitude, elevation, habitat, isolation, and so forth.
Yes.
Talk about the importance of, you're shifting the scope of everything from sort of the way it was normally done in sort of just a general country perspective to looking at things in more detail, per the frog that lives on the top of a mountain in a specific climate.
Sure.
Talk about why biogeography is important and why this is a core focus of this new book.
Biogeography is the key, because the way we understand endangered species today is based on the IUCN's Red List, redlist.org. And that's a good thing. Redlist.org is a heroic attempt to get everybody involved.
Okay.
It really is. I'm not saying it isn't, but where it falls short, I think, is it's species based. It's not even species and subspecies based. It's just species based. Subspecies is a whole other thing. Okay. But what's needed, I think, is a way to understand endangered species by where they live. What's living on this island. And there are many, many ways of I'm not saying that what I'm doing is the only way to do it. I'm just my hope is that it will be a standardized way of looking at the world. That's my cockeyed optimist way of thinking, that maybe that's kind of the way it should be. And I'd like to think that that my approach works. I'm willing to admit that many other approaches would be equally valid. I do think that the World Wildlife Fund, for instance, with their attempts to create bioregions and things like that, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because you can't square the circle. You can't square the macrocosmic and the microcosmic.
Sure.
You could only do it. There's only one, in my opinion, there's only one way to do it. You could only do it by elevation. Elevation. Islands and highlands.
Okay.
Because if you look at endangered species as in toto, as a whole, the vast majority live in places where they can get refuge from us, from human beings. They live in islands, they live in mountaintops, they live in remote places.
Gotcha.
And the best way, I think, to analyze them is not by Hispanolan pine forest ecoregion or Hispanolan xeric, or dry forest or whatever. I think the best way to do it is by island or by elevation, because elevation seems to, I tried many, many different ways of doing it, and this was the one that seemed to work for me as a writer. So if anyone out there, if you find a better way to do this, more power to you. Good on you, because nothing else worked. I tried everything else. I tried to use the World Wildlife Fund's ecoregions and bioregions. I couldn't square the circle.
Okay.
It just, it was too complex. And so I've chosen to to basically broadly, I've tried to narrow the world down into bioregions, major bioregions, which I think you're going to get people who are going to quibble. They're going to say, well, the Wallacean region is maybe belongs somewhere else, or maybe there should be a Sundaland region as well as a Wallacean and Indo-Malaysia. And those are fair arguments. Who cares, right? What I did was I took the best available evidence and I broke the world down into the broadest possible bio regions that made sense to me. And it seems to work. And within those, those realms, they're biogeographic realms. And within those biogeographic realms, I've had to break them down in some cases, into different subregions. And where, like for instance, if you take the neotropical realm, as I call it, as I define it, other people would say, well, okay, let's take the neotropical realm. Other people would say, well, the Caribbean is part of it, Central America. Or you could lump Central America and the Caribbean together as part of it. Or you could have the Amazon as a separate region, and then maybe the southern part of South America as another one, or maybe it's a completely different realm. So I looked at all the evidence, I don't know, and what I came up with was Caribbean actually has very little to do with the neotropical realm or the Nearctic realm. It's really quite distinct. And so I've kept it separate. If anybody has any better evidence, come on at me. Tell me. I mean, you know, and I'm a reasonable man. If you sway me, then you know I'll change it. But someone had to do something, because here's the point: we've been using a 19th century model, and we continue to use a 19th century biogeographic model, and that's how we comprehend the global conservation situation. And that's why it's important. We have to be able to have a standardized way of looking at the world, so that we can figure out where the resources need to be. You know, and it's a sad state of affairs when it has to be someone like me who has to make these sort of decisions. But by God, I mean, we've been waiting decades for someone to do it, and no one has, and no one's going to. No one's going to do it, because nobody has ever looked at the entire red list and written about everything that's on it in history, and no one's ever going to do it again. I'm not sure I'll be able to finish it. But I've been spending 10 years, you know, trying to get this thing done, and I'm half crazed and climbing the walls. And I'm just simply saying, here's what I came up with. I had the time to do it. I had the time to do it, and I was able to do it. And this is what I came up with. And it's a starting point. And so now you experts, come on in. Tell me where I'm wrong. Let's get it right again, you know, next time. But we had to start, because we've been nowhere. Right. We've been absolutely nowhere for so long. And see, it's statements like that get me into trouble. But then I've got nothing to lose. What have I got to lose? I'm not even employed in conservation. You know, what can the IUCN possibly do to me? Or, you know, I'm not going to get fired from my tenured professorship at some university, right, or my cushy NGO job. There's nothing that anybody can do to me, and that's why, you know, I mean, and that's a good thing, because every now and then, I think in any field, someone has to come along and do that. Yeah. And then you can come and whatever, and then come along and you can bury me later. I don't mind being a whipping boy, but at least I've moved the ball forward. I mean, give me that much, right? You know, and so you know, when I say, and again, I mean, it may sound like maybe I'm a sort of an amateur that doesn't really know what I'm doing. Well, I've looked at every entry, every vertebrate, every relevant vertebrate entry on the IUCN's redlist.org. I've done, you know, I mean, personally, I think I may have done about 5,000 of the 15,000 or so vertebrate entries, you know, on my own. And so I'm hoping that maybe someone at you know, at the World Conservation Monitoring Center in Cambridge, you know, in between, their conferences and they're grubbing for oil money and they're giving each other awards, maybe someone will look at my book and say, well, you know what, maybe we could use it and sort of update our files. So that's my hope. And yes, I realize I just burned my career. So whatever, you know what, I'm going back to history anyway. I don't even care anymore. But I do think that the book has or will have an impact. It is getting close to completion now. I wouldn't have believed that 6 months ago, but I think we are getting very close. And with any luck, it should be out in the spring of 2021. COVID certainly didn't help. On the other hand, this may not be the best environment for releasing a book anyway. Maybe I was better to wait until next year. But it's a massive book, and I'm sure that people will have a lot of fun finding my mistakes. So
you've definitely moved the ball, as you've said, and someone had to do it because we can't be dealing with 100-year-old.
Well, what it needed was one person to look at all of it.
Yeah.
Because we are living in a world, as you know, we're living in a world of specialization. Everybody is, it's a world of ultra specialization, and I'm an absolute generalist. That's, and that's where history helped, because history is about, making generalizations. And so I think what conservation needed was a historian to look at not just, not just the species, but also the history of the conservation movement. And I think it's good to do a reset once in a while. There's no way that one person can possibly keep on top of all of this. And I've had zero help from anybody. No funding, I've had nothing. And so am I bitter? Hell yeah. You do this for 10 years and see what happens to you. The IUCN sees endangered species as something that belongs to them. It's proprietary information. No one's allowed to talk about endangered species. Only they are. And, and it doesn't work that way. The endangered species belong to all of us.
Speaking about the IUCN Red List, I mean, you've been very, vocal about the need for reform, but you've also, I've seen you write about, the fact that, the real key to protecting wildlife, the conservation needs, is in protecting these areas of strategic importance. Obviously, all this takes a lot of money. Do you ever think about sort of, obviously you want to go on and do different things, but do you ever think, if $1 trillion, dropped from the sky tomorrow, what some of these, what you would do with it to protect some of these areas?
Right. It is. See, again, it's location, location, location in conservation. Half of Asia isn't worth a few acres in Central America. Okay. In terms of in terms of biodiversity. So it's about strategically protecting places. Like you could give up half of Siberia and really not lose that much, right? But there are, like, if you were to lose half of Costa Rica, it would be cataclysmic.
Yeah.
And thank God, Costa Rica is one of the better countries, and so that's it. It's really about, let's be smarter about this. It's about preserving in almost every case, not every case, but in almost every case, it's about preserving tropical areas of the world, areas of forest, generally speaking, but not always.
There is an interconnection to all this, and I think this is a very important point, whether we're talking about the rhino or whether we're talking about these little fish and frogs and so forth. That, as you were just saying, if we miss the opportunity and they're gone, it throws a lot of stuff out of balance.
Well, here's the thing. So, and I'm gonna see. Here's the thing. I can go places that other people can't, because no one can touch me. I'm unemployed. I'm a writer. Sure. I don't have tenure to protect. I can't be cancel cultured.
Yep.
You can maybe stop my books from being read or sold or something like that, but we're seeing something very dangerous, and I saw it. I was up until recently. I was on Facebook, and I had thousands and thousands of followers on Facebook, and I didn't know any of these people, whatever. But I found a very disturbing trend. And by the way, you know, I mean, I almost don't need to say it, but I am going to say it. I loathe Donald Trump and the right in general. I tend to be liberal in my thinking. That was my upbringing. That I would say that I am a liberal. So, you know, just to get that out there, the most vicious, puritanical, and I think ultimately destructive people on social media are on the left at the moment. Because you can't say things like traditional medicine is nonsense. You can't. They destroy you. They eat you alive.
Yeah.
And you know, I mean, and we have to grow up, people. We have to grow up that you know, we're living in a world now, and we accept the greatness of China as a nation, and we accept equality across the board, and that comes with responsibility. And responsibility includes, we got to stop doing that, just as we have to stop doing the things that we do that are, and by we I mean in North America, United States, Canada, because God knows we do a lot of things that are destructive to the planet as well. But we can't be afraid to talk about these things, because the moment we're afraid to talk about traditional medicine, we're done.
Yeah.
We're done. They're you know, I mean, the vulnerabilities that are coming, because we're reaching. I mean, if you look at the history of it, I mean, look at AIDS. Now, I'm not an expert. I'm not a medical doctor. I think, from what I know, I do know a little bit about primatology, and it seems to me that AIDS seems to have come about from people eating chimpanzees in the 1960s. Certainly, bushmeat hunting is not doing anybody any good.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a long-term solution for anybody. We have to talk about that. We can't just simply say, we can't have two standards. We can't. We you know, and I'll go further. I'm across the board against hunting in any form. In any form. Like I can't even comprehend the mindset of somebody wanting to kill something. I'm glad I don't have to do it in order to eat. So that's true. I can see where people might have to do it, but bushmeat isn't going to solve Nigeria's food shortage.
Like anything, you know, I spend my time in the pharmaceutical industry, and you know, there's things that are hot and sexy in the pharmaceutical industry, and there's things that we forget about. And you know, what's one big
Right.
thing we've forgotten about the last few decades is, hey, antibiotics. We don't make them anymore. We don't research them anymore. And what's happening? We're getting killed off by some pretty nasty microbes nowadays. So, but you know, some of it's
Yep.
coming around. I mean, it's not you know, it's not as sexy as Alzheimer's disease or the newest cancer drug, but you know, so you do have people that eventually, you know, come back to the table, and it just takes time, unfortunately. And yeah, I mean, I wish, yeah, as in all these cases, everyone have their own show. I wish there was, you know, a button you could push and have unlimited, you know, infinite dollars fall from the sky to deal with these things.
See here, let me stop you right there, though, because it doesn't have to be about that.
Sure,
Because
sure,
it isn't about dollars. It's about spending them where they need to
sure,
be.
sure.
And you could, like for instance, when, you know, I mentioned earlier about the Edinburgh Zoo,
Yep.
and you know, they spent it may have been 10 million, you know, dollars trying to get these two reluctant pandas to breed with each other, and it didn't go anywhere. And at the same time, a subspecies of Asian two-horned rhinoceros went extinct.
Yep.
And it went extinct stupidly, because it would have been so easy just to have simply, like, if you would, here's another, I'm going to throw another truth bomb out here. Are you ready for it?
Sure.
Okay. I think that we should get our hands on every rhino that we can, and bring them into captivity, or take them someplace where people can't get their hands on them, because none of them are going to survive in the wild.
Yeah.
None of them. Like, if you think of, there was a subspecies. Do you remember in the 1990s when they called them, at the time, they called them Javan rhinos? Okay, when it was a type of Asian one-horned rhinoceros. It was a subspecies, And it's best known as the Javan rhino because the 50 or so that still survive live in the Ujung Kulong Peninsula of Western Java. But they found some in Vietnam in the mid 1990s. They found a small population. The World Wildlife Fund found a small population, and it was actually a different subspecies, but same species. Okay, let's not get bogged down in terminology, but it was the same species. And what did they do? They told the world, isn't it great? We rediscovered a small population of, of these incredibly rare rhinos in Cat Tien. I think it was Cat Tien National Park, but don't hold me to it. It was one of those national parks in Vietnam. And within a year, because poachers watch TV and read too,
Yeah.
and within a year, they were wiped out. And not just that population, that subspecies, that mainland population, and within a year. So I mean, so we have to be smarter about things. And so one of the things I don't do in my book, I don't give, wherever possible, I don't give precise localities
Okay.
of where incredibly endangered species live, critically endangered, where if they're restricted to a single locality, I never give that location. I think that there are some things that need to be top secret now in conservation, and but it flies right in the face of academia. It's science. Everybody should know this. And I think we have to evolve. We have to keep some things secret.
Mm-hmm.
And as awful as that sounds, as repugnant as that's coming out of my mouth, as repugnant as that sounds, that's where we are now. And that said, I know of the existence of certain species that people think are extinct that I'm never going to reveal.
Got it.
And I can tell you stories, I'll tell you off the record, but I can tell you about things that, well, they would turn your hair white. I mean, and it's just because I've been around long enough and people have told me and they trust that I won't sort of reveal it. And I think that's the way it should be. Like, for instance, if for instance, someone discovered a population of Tasmanian wolves, like thylacines, say in New Guinea or Western Australia, I wouldn't tell you. Like, I really don't think that there's anything to be gained from that. I think it, and so I think we need to be smarter. I think, we can't just simply broadcast everything. And by the same token, when I see, one of the things that young people are particularly in love with today, I think are, cameras. They'll set up these remote cameras in the middle of the wilderness. Well, that's not helpful. Showing people where, oh, well, hey, look, isn't this great? Like, on, like I'll see on CNN, a picture of snow leopards caught on a camera trap, and they'll give the locality. It's like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
What are you doing? Like, I mean, like you're putting a bullseye on them. Like, we're living in a world where instantaneously, if someone reads on CNN, like they're literally following this stuff. The people, who's reading scientific papers now? Poachers. They're, and people and creeps and trophy hunters and creeps in the exotic animal trade, particularly herpetologists. They may be the only ones that are reading those papers, except for me. So we have to stop doing that. We have to stop telling people about, rediscovered populations, because as soon as you do that, they're done. 9 times out of 10, unless they're very fortunate in living in a place that's well protected. But no one has enough money to protect all of it anymore. That bothers me,
Yeah. I mean, and just a side note, in concert with this episode, when it comes out, we did an episode with the banning of trophy hunting
right.
organization in the UK, so it's going to fit rather nicely. But yeah, it's sobering stuff, but I'm glad that you're behind it and having these insights and putting together this book. And I'm really wishing you the best with it and everything that comes next. For everybody that is going to be listening on the various podcast networks or watching on the ideaXme YouTube channel, you've been listening and watching Matthew Richardson, author, primatologist, conservationist. Keep an eye out for his new mega volume, Threatened and Recently Extinct Vertebrates of the World, the Biogeographic Approach. Matthew, thank you for everything that you're doing for the world and for all these species and for the next generation that's going to follow in your work. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show today, and thank you for, as we say, moving the human story forward a bit, because this is an extremely important area of endeavor. So really wishing you the best at the next phase.